This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's November 16th, 2021. I'm Ross John Fortuné. The deadline for federal employees to be vaccinated against the novel coronavirus without an approved exemption is next week. Managers can start the perhaps severe disciplinary process soon thereafter, as federal employment attorney Stephanie Raptulli told our show earlier this month.
They will pursue a progressive discipline, although I think it is possible to go straight to termination if an employee has made it clear that they will not get the vaccination or put in for any sort of exemption request. But I think the agencies and the administration has tried to guide towards progressive discipline. So starting with a letter of reprimand, counseling, and then extending the deadline perhaps to a suspension, to then termination.
The Government Business Council, the research arm of Government Executive, conducted a survey of federal employees recently, finding that more than half of respondents either strongly or somewhat disagreed with the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccine mandate for feds. People responded to the survey with comments against the mandate, including some questioning the legality of it, though the courts have affirmed the mandate as recently as last week. GovExec correspondent Courtney Bublé writes the Coronavirus Roundup. She'll join me after a short break to discuss the survey results.
The IRS may soon receive a big budget boost. How should they spend it? Please join former IRS commissioners, technologists, and human resource experts as they discuss how the IRS can use these new funds to improve service and shrink the tax gap. The 3-part seminar is free, pre-recorded, and available on demand at napawash.org. Then go to the About Us tab and select Events.
Vaccine mandates have been a controversial subject in the American discourse since they became widely available earlier this year. The COVID-19 vaccine mandate deadline for federal employees is next week, presumably with discipline following for feds who don't have an approved exemption. The Government Business Council conducted a survey of federal employees recently, and it found that more than half of the respondents either strongly or somewhat disagreed with the Biden administration's vaccine mandate. GovExec staff correspondent Courtney Bublé wrote the story about the survey, and she joins me now to discuss the survey and its results. Welcome back to the program.
Always good to be here.
So what did our audience have to say about the mandates? How do they feel? And do they like this vaccine mandate?
So overall, the top line numbers say that the majority of the federal employees surveyed, 53%, strongly or somewhat disagreed with the vaccine mandate for federal employees, while 44% strongly or somewhat agreed with it. Now, this is just the top line number. I know we're going to talk about this later, but in order to really, I think, understand this survey and what we reported is to really take into account the nuance of arguments that people have. And I know we're going to get to this, but that's something I want to stress right off the top, because looking at the comments, you see that, yes, while the majority do disagree with it, there are various reasons for that. And like I said, we're going to get to that, but I just wanted to add that. And another top line number is that 33% of respondents said they thought the vaccine will be slightly or moderately effective in protecting the federal workforce from the coronavirus. 42% thought it would be very or extremely effective, and 29% thought it would be not effective. And this survey was done by Government Business Council, which is our research arm. It was done between October 27th and November 2nd, and it was given to government executive and defense fund readers. We had 3,186 respondents. I think that's the most they've ever gotten for a survey like this. There was a 95% confidence level and a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. And now, while the vast majority do work for federal agencies, there were a few that work in other government spaces. But yeah, those are just some of the top line information and data points, and then we can talk about the rest further.
We'll get into the nuances that you had mentioned, but I'll just put my own sort of thoughts on it to say that I was a little surprised by the numbers the results when we got them. The more I looked into it, the less I was surprised. I think, to your point, the nuances of the open-ended responses sort of painted a broader picture than just a bunch of people that hate vaccines. So to that end, you saw the results. You saw the open-ended responses. What is this nuance that you're talking about? How does it explain? Can you give our listeners an idea of what the respondents really said and how they really feel?
Sure. So I think the best way to really understand what we captured is to read some of the comments. Now, I skimmed hundreds of them, so obviously I can't read all of those, but I'm going to pull out a few that I think captured things well. One says, "I am not pro or anti-vaccine. I am pro-choice. It should be a choice, not a mandate. Last I knew, this was a free country." Now, another says, "The vaccine mandate is most likely illegal. It is also probably effective. It, however, does not mean the federal government should have the power to force adults and civilian workforce to get a shot they don't want." Another said, "A coworker's choice to not be vaccinated increases my potential exposure to COVID, particularly increases my workload if I have to cover for them and if they are out ill, and increases my cost of federal employees' health benefits and Medicare." Now, I think we're going to also talk about telework later in the show, but there's also some differing arguments with that. While some people thought that if you're on telework or 100% telework, you don't need the mandate, others said that, it should be regardless of that fact. Or people who don't telework or who have been going in at least one day a week said that, or some said in the comments that, they've been on the front lines for almost 2 years at this point and they've been fine, or they say they've been fine and that they don't need this mandate. So once again, I cannot stress enough how nuanced these thoughts are and a diverse array of opinions.
Right. Okay. So let's boil some of that down a little bit. We get a lot of comments to our email address, my individual email address, and to our webmaster inbox, and just generally to our tips line and stuff. And I'm not going to act like I'm the foremost expert on epidemiology or whatever, but there is a lot of sort of sketchy information. We had one person who worked for an agency said, this is a city problem and not a rural problem. And this person worked in one of the hottest spots in the country, like that morning. Though no, she was not in a big city. It's like the R number was huge. I've seen some of the responses as well, and it is sort of frustrating to see how sort of anti-scientific they are oftentimes, or particularly when you mentioned some people said they thought the mandate is illegal. I mean, we've had courts over and over back it up. But the survey also sort of broke it down a little by people who work in the office sometimes against those who are on full telework. How do those people vary, and what do those numbers look like?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, the survey did look at 100% telework versus people in the office at least one day a week. Now, when you're or in the workplace, that could be anybody from working a desk job to, somebody on the front lines at a VA clinic. So those who are going into the workplace at least one day a week are more likely to strongly disapprove of the mandate. And the opposite was true for those on 100% telework. And like I said earlier, we saw in some comments that people thought, they said, because we've been on the front lines for so long, we've been fine. We don't need this. Now, it will be interesting to see how this fits into the agency's changing telework policies. I know we covered on GovExec's website about the new guidance OPM put out last week about encouraging more telework going on. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how the two play together. But yeah, it's like you said, we've both talked to federal employees in our emails and through, just me doing stories. And a lot of the frontline workers, or not a lot, but I've definitely spoken with enough that are against it, even though they have to be interacting with people every day. But also in the comments, we did see people being scared of going into the workplace and being around coworkers who are potentially not vaccinated. So it's both.
We've definitely gotten comments as recently as this morning that basically said, we have to be vaccinated in our agency, but the people who come in to deal with us, I won't out the agency that this person worked for, the sort of customers such as they were, although that's sort of a misnomer here. They don't have, there's no check on them. So what, where's this sort of going to play out? How am I going to get sick? Breakthrough cases are real, all those kinds of things. And again, I'm sympathetic to that, because that obviously is not something you want. You don't want to be exposed to people who are potentially going to get you sick, but that there's a whole different conversation that we have had on the show about the jurisdiction of these kinds of mandates, and they don't apply to every single person. God knows states have filed plenty of lawsuits that you have covered against these kind of things. I guess we'll end on this just because we'll both put on our analyst hats, and I'm sure we'll have listeners who are upset with my framing of this to a certain extent. But I won't frame it at all to say that, why do you think it's almost a 50-50 split?
Yeah, 53 to 44.
Yeah, so you're looking at basically 50-50 when you bring in margin of error. Why do you think that is? Is it just the environment, the hyper-partisan environment?
It's a little bit, but a lot of these views are kind of representative of what we see nationwide. There are 2 million federal employees. There's millions more contractors. So I think a lot of what we see in these results are probably reflective of what the nation as a whole is thinking. And, it's basically 50-50, but when you break it down, the differences in why people are supportive of it or they're not is very different. So I wouldn't say that, 50% of people think this because of this. And initially when I saw the hard data, I kind of thought that, but then once again, reading those comments about why they're in support of it, or why they think it's effective, but not legal, or maybe it's effective and legal, but they don't support it. And I think that's kind of the way you have to think about it, that those top line numbers really don't tell the full story, because for a lot of people, it's very personal. It's politicized to some degree for some people. And it depends on the area that you work in geographically. We talked about earlier, some differences between people on telework, people not on telework. I would be curious to know what the political breakdown was. We did a survey for political parties, and for agencies, it wasn't significant enough to fully break it down. So I would love to see another survey, a larger survey that looks at those things. I guess those are my takeaways.
Yeah, you're fairer than I am on this, certainly. I mean, again, I know this is a very fraught issue, but reading the responses or reading some of the feedback we get, and I didn't dig into it as deeply as you did. I have a little less patience for a lot of that stuff. That I can hear the telework argument a lot more clearly. I guess, again, especially having spoken to friends of mine who are feds, who are managers, who more than anything don't want to deal with it because their staff is on telework, and they don't want to have to discipline people. They don't want to have to argue with people about this stuff. And if no one's interacting with anyone, what's the harm? I think is a somewhat reasonable conversation. But broadly, some of these other arguments are admittedly a little lost on me, though again, I imagine some listeners will be less than happy about my saying that.
There were a significant amount of comments of people saying, you should get the mandate, I support the mandate, get the vaccine, blah, blah, blah. And this is something that was not asked in the survey, but a lot of people mentioned worries about job loss and, not just staffing shortages as a result of the mandate. And now we're recording this on November 15th, so it's too early to say if that will or will not happen, but a lot of people raised that concern. And as a result, they raised concerns about not being able to deliver on the mission of their agencies or serve their customers. This was one of the most striking comments in my mind. Somebody said, quote, "This is a train wreck, but may provide promotion opportunities for the younger workforce." So this person is, I guess, seeing a silver lining. But people raise concerns about the pipeline of talent. And again, that was not part of the survey, but a lot of people brought it up. So that's something I'll certainly be looking out for as I continue reporting on this.
Yeah, we talked to Stephanie Raptulli, who's a federal employment attorney, last week, and we certainly were talking a lot about that, about the hiring and retention stuff, and what that will mean when these when the mandate comes down, obviously there are a lot more federal employees than there are, for example, local employees in any individual office. But I'm reminded of there has been a lot more bark than bite in a lot of those kind of situations so far, as far as we're going to quit before we get the shot or whatever. But again, I'm going to be opining too much in this to make anybody happy. So instead, Courtney, I will bid you adieu and thank you for being on the show with us.
Of course, anytime.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortuna. We want to thank Courtney Bublé for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.
The IRS may soon receive a big budget boost. How should they spend it? Please join former IRS commissioners, technologists, and human resource experts as they discuss how the IRS can use these new funds to improve service and shrink the tax gap. The 3-part seminar is free, pre-recorded, and available on demand at napawash.org. Then go to the About Us tab and select Events.